Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar. My name is Joy Lynn and I'm with DMEI, and today I'm joined by my colleague Jim McCall for a presentation from MMGY Global 15 Portrait of American Traveler Study. Now in its 25th year, this study actually reveals actionable results on the emerging vacation habits, preferences, and intentions of American travelers. Here today to highlight 4 key shifts revealed in the study is none other than Peter Yesowich, Vice Chairman of MMGY Global. Welcome, Peter. We're glad you could join us today.
Thank you, Joy. Good afternoon. And Jim, thank you, and good afternoon or good morning all, depending on where you may be. And I'm sorry, Joy, should we proceed?
Yeah. So before we get started, I'm just going to go over a couple of housekeeping items for today's presentation. First of all, the webinar will be recorded and we'll share it on a follow-up email about 4 business days after the live broadcast. Secondly, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and submit them throughout the presentation through the question panel of the GoToWebinar dashboard, and Jim will be monitoring them throughout the presentation for Peter to answer them in the last 15 minutes of the broadcast. With that, we can go ahead and start the presentation. So Peter, please take it away.
Great, thank you. And again, good morning or good afternoon all. What I'm going to do today is give you just some of the highlights of what is a very, very deep analysis of travel trends in America. And I'll begin really with some insights from one of the pieces of work that we do that is really a forecasting piece called Travel Horizons. And just a little bit of the history of this survey. We actually began this work in the first quarter of 2007. And if you remember, the state of the travel industry back then was fairly perilous because we were right at the edge of the beginning of the Great Recession and lots of anxiety in the financial markets and so forth. And we decided at that point that we needed a tool that would help us forecast demand, because we in our company manage a very substantial amount of media money. And most of what exists in the travel category, even till today, is historical in nature. So what happens is you'll look at reports on who's visited, what they spent, how they booked, and so forth. But Travel Horizons was created for the purpose of looking to the future. So what we do every 90 days is we poll 2,300 respondents. We refresh the sample every 90 days. And instead of asking them about what they have done, we ask them about what it is they plan to do with respect to travel. So I'm going to give you a quick historical perspective here and then make a forecast, which I think you hopefully will enjoy because it's really quite optimistic. But if you look to the left of the slide, you'll see we began calculating something called the Traveler Sentiment Index from the survey, again, back in the first quarter of 2007. The TSI actually derives from 5 individual calculations where we look at things like the time available for travel, the perceived affordability of travel, the safety of travel, and so forth. So each of those is scored individually, and then what we do is we blend them to create this index. So the index begins at the value of 100 back in, again, first quarter of 2007. Now you'll notice as we move through the balance of that year into 2008, what was happening is the TSI was dropping like a rock. We got to the fall of 2008. You can see in October there it was the lowest level we've recorded. And then remarkably what happened is in the ensuing roughly 9 months, this thing began to spike. And as it turns out, it was one of the 5 variables that we measure that was driving that increase in sentiment, and that happened to be the perceived affordability of travel. And I think most on the call will remember back in 2009 that there was a kind of a universal marketing strategy adopted by just about every travel service marketer, which is to sell it on the cheap. And discounting was prevalent, and with the integration of that with what was happening online in terms of the ability to communicate those deals, the thing actually remained fairly buoyant. And you saw or see in this particular slide how that continued through basically essentially the fall of 2010. Then what happened is in the first quarter of 2011 it spiked. I think a lot of people in our business looked at that and said, well, gee, maybe the worst is past. And we were just beginning to see signs that we were emerging from the Great Recession, and many in the travel industry at that point said, well, we perhaps arrived at the point in time that we've been kind of lusting after for the previous 3 years, which was the point at which we could start regaining pricing power, and that was the ability to increase fares and rates. If you'll notice what happened to the TSI in the subsequent year, basically it was pretty erratic. It declined. We saw a similar pattern that emerged in the first quarter of 12. And then if you take a look at where this number has gone since the first quarter of 12, that green line is the regression line. And you can see that we actually punctured that, that historical 100 index mark back in the spring of 14, and essentially it's been rising since then. So what do you make of all of this, and how do we? The way I would characterize this is we have never seen in the past 8 years a more optimistic time with respect to traveler sentiment expressed toward travel than we have today. And that's a wonderful, I think, statement to make, and certainly there's lots of evidence of that around the country, whether it's climbing hotel occupancies, load factors on aircraft, passenger counts on cruise ships, and so forth. And so you're beginning to see kind of the manifestation of this lift in the TSI take place in all of these aspects of the business. Punchline here is that there's nothing on the horizon that would suggest to us that this line is going to flatten or decline, which is good news, with the exception of the one thing that we can't control, and that's if some crazed individual drives a van into Times Square and blows it up. And I hate to say that, but it's the kind of thing that everybody in the travel business needs to think about, particularly in the uncertain world in which we live today, with all of the very difficult things that are happening around the world. But in any event, on a positive note, certainly from a domestic point of view, everything is pointing north. Put that in perspective, and I think many of the destination marketing people on the call will hopefully find this to be illuminating. You're looking here at the percentage of adults in the country at 6 points in time, all of which were taken at the same point in time, that said they had planned or were planning to take at least one overnight trip for leisure purposes in the next 6 months, because this is a leading indicator of demand. You'll notice I've circled the 61%. Let me go back there, 61%, which essentially is no change from the wave 3 that we saw in 14. But if you look at that trajectory, since 2012, you can see a huge increase in that sentiment, as demonstrated by, again, what I think people in the business have observed in terms of increasing occupancy since 2012, certainly in the lodging business. Now, note that 6 out of 10 adults say they're planning to take a leisure trip. In this slide, you see the comparable for adults who are planning to take a business trip. And you'll notice a couple of things. One is the trajectory is positive. 2012. Slide, 4 years worth of consumer sentiment with data on not just reflected optimism among travel population in America. And on the left, you'll see the different dimensions of optimism that we measure, whether it's about your future, your job, the country, and so forth. And I've highlighted in the green arrow on the right the one that is particularly interesting to us because the optimism or lack thereof about your job is the single most accurate indicator of what's likely to happen to the travel business in America. And if you think about that for a second, it makes a lot of sense, because if you are uncertain about your future, it tends to have a very negative, depressing effect on your discretionary expenditures, one of which obviously is travel for most people. And when you have a very positive outlook, the converse is true. So if you take a look at the trend line since 2011, you can see it's up 7 points, which statistically is absolutely very significant. And I think it really does underscore the shift that we've observed in terms of how people feel generally. Because you'll notice if you scan the other changes, for the most part, they're relatively insignificant, whether it's perception of the optimism people have about personal future or the future of the country, for that matter. But the one really discernible difference is this one, and that, as it turns out, is the one of greatest interest to, I think, us in the travel business. The other piece of work I'm going to cite from here quickly on the highlights that we'll talk about briefly is the Portrait of American Travelers. Some on the call may recall this piece of work actually was titled differently about 5 years ago. It was called the National Travel Monitor, and we rebranded it about 5 years ago. And we made some fundamental changes to the methodology, which I'll just recite quickly because it's important to understand this before we look at the numbers. This is an annual survey, not a quarterly survey, similar to Travel Horizons. The sample is very robust. It's 2,800 probability sample American travelers. So the numbers that we're about to look at are very accurate in terms of their representation of the population of all active American travelers, 18 years of age plus. The other important screening characteristic is with respect to household income. And you'll notice that a minimum annual household income is $50,000. And in fact, we actually have a sample of 810 respondents with minimum annual household income of $125,000. The reason that's relevant is the median household income in the country today, which is half above, half below, is about $52,500. So based on what I just shared, you'll understand that what we've done is we've consciously eliminated about half of the households in the country in the survey work. So as we go through this, some of you may notice some discrepancies with other data points with which you are familiar from other surveys. And typically the explanation for that difference is what I've just identified here, and that is we're looking at a sample that reflects the top half of American households. And in fact, on a couple of these, I'll call out the top roughly 15%, which is that population of households with an annual income over $125,000. The dynamics that we're going to talk about briefly this afternoon, and these are just the highlights that have really bubbled up to the top. For those of you that are not familiar with the depths of the American Traveler Survey, I'll comment on how you can become more familiar with that at the end of the presentation today. But there are only 4 that we're going to talk about today that I think are most relevant just because of the dramatic changes that we've seen occur over the past roughly 18 to 24 months. You see them here. Number 1 is the shift in the way consumers are searching and booking, and we'll talk about that and share some data points here in a second. Cruising is exploding in a positive way, and it's remarkable because it's a business that many will acknowledge suffered from adverse publicity over the course of the past couple of years, whether it was through some of the tragedies with the accidents or some of the problems they've had with hygiene and so forth. But the numbers are just continue to go up significantly, and I think that's a testament to the appeal of the product. We'll talk a little bit about this fascinating group emerging, the millennials, and I'll make a couple of comments about millennials from a destination marketing point of view, which I think are really provocative, and then finally a little bit on what's happening with social media. So let's start with the issue of what's happening with respect to how consumers are searching and booking. And the foundation thought is reflected in this slide, and that is that about half of, now by the way, every number we're looking at now is not a general population number. So this 53%, you now know, is active travelers in America over 18 years of age with an annual household income above $50,000. Okay, so those are the screens on these numbers. 53% of them agree with this statement. They say, although the recession is over, I still don't feel or act like it is. And I suspect many people on the call privately feel that way. Interestingly enough, that sentiment, you can see that here it's down from 1% to 12%. The fact of the matter is, half of American adults who still agree with us. If you think about that insight and how that impacts the way people go about searching, whether it's searching for an airfare or a hotel rate, or for that matter, anything they might want to purchase online, it has a significant impact on the way they do it. And in this slide, you'll see some of the evidence of how that's changed dramatically over the past 2 years. So as you see in the description on the slide, this is the percentage of American travelers at 2 points in time, 2013 and last year, which we report as 2015, who tell us that they've gone online to get travel information from at least one OTA on a regular basis. Okay, now this is for leisure planning, okay, not for business planning, but the numbers are roughly comparable. Now, when you see that kind of degradation, this is well beyond the range that we would expect to see in sample variance. And the translation there is simply something's happening. And, you know, that something is pretty obvious here, and that is that we're seeing a decline in the percentage of adults who are actually going to OTAs for that kind of content. This is an illustration of what is driving that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight in this slide in the 4 red circles the trend in terms of market penetration for a number of the leading OTA sites and booking sites, for that matter, that consumers use when planning and booking travel. And the way you would interpret this is if we take a look at Expedia, for example, the first entry in the table, 42% of active travelers in America, again with our screens, over 18, household income 50K plus, 42% of them in 2013, by our estimate, went into Expedia on at least one occasion in 2013. Now, many times people look at that and say, well, you know, that doesn't jive with my understanding of Expedia's traffic or share. And this is not a share calculation. It's a market penetration calculation. So, for example, I may go into Expedia 10 times. Somebody else on the call may go into Expedia literally 150 times or 1,000 times during the course of the year. Those are measures of frequency and traffic, and that's not what this is. So the way to interpret this is the percentage of active travelers who meet the screens who reported to us that they've done this on at least one occasion. Now you'll notice that that's declined, and if you go to all the red circles, you notice the trend is replicated for all of the sites that I've highlighted here. And I've now just highlighted one other in the green circle, and it happens to be the only one that has demonstrated an increase over the 2-year period of all those measured. You can see that we did measure Google separately in 2013, and that's TripAdvisor. And you know, that we could speculate as to what is driving that. In a little later in this presentation, I'll give you some insights into what we think is driving that, and certainly their recent entry into providing you know, booking options and so forth is presumably part of what's driving this, and also makes the site a little more attractive. But it's very interesting content, and the content that consumers find very valuable when it comes to making assessments about certain suppliers or destinations. Now, there are 2 basic questions that we ask in the American Traveler in the black color on the bottom, if you just look at the legend here. The first is, where do you go to get the best prices for travel services? And if you look at the response options on the graph here, on the left, it begins with to a travel service provider website. I'm going to call that brand.com. To an OTA, right? And after travel agent, right? That's on to a travel service provider. And then highlighted here that 64% now of travelers who meet all the screens I've just identified say that you go to brand.com for the best prices. Now, that's a remarkable transformation in terms of consumer sentiment, because that was clearly not the case as we were moving through the Great Recession in 2009, 2010, and so forth. In fact, if I showed you the comparables, it's really amazing to see the shift that has occurred. Part of that's been driven by the fact that suppliers have very aggressively attempted to communicate that consumers will never overpay on their site and offer rate guarantees, and they spent a lot of money trying to communicate that to traveling public, and you can see from these data that seems to be getting some traction. The other part is the shifting sentiment on the part of consumers, and the fact that they're really a little more, or I should say a little less austere, you know, and driven by deals today as they were, frankly, as recent as 3 and 4 years ago. If we take a look at the next statement that or question that we ask, which is in the orange color, you'll notice on the bottom of the legend, what's the most convenient way to arrange travel plans? We see again that those consumers tell us that they believe that the most convenient way to do that is through brand.com too. We could speculate as to the reason for that, but I would just say in my judgment it's because a lot of the branded sites have worked very hard to essentially improve the content, improve the navigational aspects of their sites, and make that whole online experience a lot more engaging for consumers. Now, lots of data here, but this is kind of the money shot for me, so let me just describe very quickly what we're looking at. And up on the upper left-hand side, beginning with ideas and inspiration, these are the 4 discernible steps that we measure in terms of how people go from being inspired about taking a trip to, at the other end of the continuum, actually book the reservation. So they get inspired, they're going to do some searching for advice and ratings, they're going to compare some prices, they're going to do some shopping, and finally going to make a booking. Now, these things do not necessarily occur sequentially, but it's just it's an easy way to present the data and to make the point. So if you focus on the column entitled Ideas and Inspiration, what you're looking at here are the top 5 sources out of a total of 35 that we measure that consumers tell us they consult at that stage in the journey. And you'll notice that number 1 here, ranked number 1, family and friends. That's the commentary that people get from family and friends. No surprise there, 39%. But of all of the non-family and friend sources, you'll notice that the one that is ranked most highly is search engines at 35%. If you continue to look down that, there's some surprises. Magazine articles, 31%. Destination websites, we'll come back to that in a minute. Printed visitor guides, 31. And if we actually continued below the 5th rank, we'd see things like television and so forth. Now, what's interesting is the takeaway from this is that if you're in the business of inspiring prospective guests, in a moment you're going to see the media strategy you need to implement to do that. It's going to be fundamentally different than if you're at the other end of the continuum, where you have a lot of inspired people that are shopping for deals and reservations. So if we continue through the continuum, we go to the 2nd step, advice and ratings, you'll notice, not surprisingly, travel review websites go right to the top. By the way, travel review websites were part of the 30-plus that we measured under ideas and inspiration. The reason you don't see them in the slide is they didn't make the top 5 in terms of rank. Then we go to comparing prices and features. Not surprisingly, search engines ascend to the top again at 39%. Then finally, we get to booking, and this is where we see, again, brand.com and search engines kind of slugging it out. But again, for the first time, certainly in the last couple of years, we see the brand.com is edged out as a source that travelers tell us that they engage when engaged in that activity. Now, I'm going to put a couple of arrows in here. This one is, you'll notice the green arrow from the advice ratings step in the process. You can see it's identified as 4th ranked with 24%. And you'll notice when it comes to making reservations, brand.com is 1st ranked at 24%. The percentages are important, but less important than the rank in terms of how you would read these numbers. And what the data are simply telling us is that obviously the information sources that people use when they're ready to book are fundamentally different than when they're being inspired. Now, for most on the call, this red line will be of interest, and that's the role of destination websites. And you can see that destination websites are cited by these travelers as very important when it comes to there being a source of inspiration when they evaluate specific destinations. But as they proceed through the journey to booking, you'll notice that there's a pretty consistent degradation here, and destination websites show up as 5th ranked when it comes to making reservations. I know there are lots of destinations that have constituents that pound the table and say you need to have a booking engine on our site, and why aren't we getting more reservations from the site, and so forth. And these are some pretty powerful data to go ahead and defuse that discussion. And the answer is because that's not the way consumers book, and nor is it the way that they think they're going to accomplish the 2 things that I mentioned a moment ago, which is to get the best prices and the most convenient way to book. Now, I realize that cruising is maybe just a small dimension of the business of most people represented on the call, so I'll do this quickly. And here I'm showing you some generational data because I think the common belief, certainly among people in the business, is that cruisers are aged, and this is a business that is uniquely suited to people who are 55, 60 plus in age, and there's not a lot of action below that. Well, take a look at these numbers, and certainly if you look at the incidence of who took a cruise vacation, the numbers would tend to support that. You can see that 16% of mature took a cruise vacation versus only, say, 10% of extras. But the thing that really is remarkable is you take a look at the interest measure in cruising, which is up 40% in 1 year, and you'll notice that the locus of that interest is highest, not just among matures, but equally among millennials. And I think a lot of that is attributed to the fact that the cruise product has evolved to the point where it appeals a great deal to families. Some cruise products appeal to millennials specifically without kids. So I think we're seeing an evolution of that product and that experience that's been really quite rapid and is really beginning to have a significant impact on where demand ultimately shows up in the travel business. So for those of you that have cruise ports in your destination, that's going to become an increasingly valuable part of your attribute mix. And for those of you that might be thinking of developing that, and you certainly have the resources to do it, this is a business that's going to go nowhere but up in our judgment. And it's got all the right signs. It's inclusively priced. It's typically sold in a short form. Most popular form of cruising is the 3- and 4-night cruise. And the nice part for consumers is you typically wake up every day in a different destination. Now let's talk a little bit about millennials, and the first thing that I wanted to share with everybody is just a basic understanding of the market force here. And the question is, who are the new market makers? And boomers have been the market makers essentially for the travel business for the past 20 years for two reasons. One is just the sheer size of the market, and the second is that's where the money was. If you take a look, though, at millennials, they actually outnumber boomers in terms of the sheer magnitude of the market size. Now, there's a lot of debate about when the millennial generation initial birth date and end birth date begin and end, and I'm not going to get into that debate because there's no consistency on that, but essentially we define them as today is between 18 and 35 years of age, and it's a slight premium, as you can see, in terms of sheer market size. So the important thing for everybody to understand here is what you're going to look at in the next few minutes is something a lot more than to be looked at casually, because this is a market force that is very substantial, and as you're going to see here, also has a completely different view of the world of travel. So if we take a look at the responses to expected travel for the year ahead, again, this is for leisure, by generational group. On the left-hand side, under total, you can see this is a very simple calculation. We simply ask in aggregate the 2,800 respondents, you planning to take more trips in the year ahead, fewer trips, or the same? And you'll notice that this year 24% more, 18% fewer, so there's a net difference of 6. Good news is we haven't seen a net difference that high in the past 7 years, so that's a good leading indicator. But if you take a look at the net difference for millennials, you can see it's significantly higher. 34% say more, 17% say fewer, and that by comparison is dramatically higher than what we see for the other 3 generational cohorts. In fact, 2 of them you can see are indicating slight negative trends, and extras up slightly positively. So not only is this a significant market force, as we've just demonstrated, but it also happens to be the one that has expressed the greatest intention with respect to future travel. A couple of insights about the group. 7 out of 10 say they agree with the statement, I'm more likely to try new things while I'm on vacation. And I like to say that this sentiment is probably the single greatest challenge for every DMO in the country. And the reason I say that is because the translated sentiment here for these travelers is, more often than not, been there, done that. And that is novelty is what drives their interest, attracts them to new experiences, new destinations, and they are far more likely to visit a destination, give you solid 10s in all the ratings, and the next breath say, we're not coming back. At least we're not coming back for a couple of years, because their interests take them elsewhere. So this whole idea of developing repeat patronage with this crowd is a challenge, for sure. And I say it's the biggest challenge for DMOs because the implication is you have to continue to refresh the destination and the experience in order to continue to appeal to this crowd. We could talk for hours on that, but I simply want to make the point that this sentiment is a real challenge for every destination. The other thing that's very interesting is that 6 out of 10 agree with this statement, that is taking a vacation is the event that I look forward to most each year. And I think that simply underscores the importance that they ascribe to leisure time. We have a statement in the American Traveler about whether or not you'd be interested in trading an increase in your pay for an increase in your vacation time. Not surprisingly, when you look at boomers and matures, they take the pay. You look at millennials and Xers, they take the time. And this is, I think, reflective of that. So a couple of very compelling observations here, because the issue of novelty is key in terms of continuing to attract this crowd. Millennial families, too, also have a very different pattern of behavior, vacation behavior, as demonstrated here. You got 27% as couples without kids, right, that intend to take more vacations. But you'll notice that when you factor kids into the equation for this age cohort, what happens is that number rises dramatically. The reason for that is, in our view, that the parents in those millennial family households are typically both working full-time. In fact, that number is pushing 70%. So what happens is the availability of time to reunite as a family is really the premium, and the psychology of that's very compelling for those people. In fact, if there's anybody on the phone that falls in that age cohort, I think you know what I'm talking about, and that is increasingly they're looking for ways to reunite the family because both the parents are working, they feel this sense of parental guilt, they haven't spent enough time together, and that translates into increased demand for travel. And this I also, I think, reinforces that point where you can see not only are they planning to take more of those trips, but they're also prepared to spend more to actually have those experiences. Another interesting thing that's happening is we're watching very carefully how the influence of social media is evolving as it relates to both destination and supplier selection. And what's interesting here is if you take a look at the engagement measure, this is now our engagement. This is by self-report of the respondents. So I'm not talking about the kind of metrics that you would typically look at in terms of website visitation and engagement, but rather this is by self-report when we ask the travelers if they've done things like, have you been into an online community? Have you authored a review on a website? Did you seek and retrieve information and so forth in the past 12 months? And you'll notice that number is growing a little bit. It is significant statistically, that 2 points based on the size of our sample. But if I were to show you the trajectory from, say, 2010, the curve is beginning to plateau. So what that says to us is that the early adopters have adopted, the people who want to engage with this medium are already there. Not to say that there aren't more that are, forthcoming, but certainly not in the same numbers that we observed over the past 3 or 4 years. Interesting observation and important depending on how you think about the use of social media. So let's zoom in on one in particular. This is in terms of engagement with travel review websites and online community blogs. And you can see the first measurement we've taken here is the percentage of travelers that have gone into one of these outlets to get information about a destination service provider during the past 12 months. You'll notice we're putting now a different screen on this, which is the affluent screen that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So now we're looking at data for the top, essentially 15% of households, 125,000 plus in income. In fact, in our sample of the 800, we have over 400 of those with an annual income, base annual income of $250 plus, and an actual average annual income of about $405,000. So we're looking at a very affluent group. And what's really remarkable here, and the reason you see that orange circle around the 41, is that that is a statistically higher measure in 2015 for affluent travelers than it was the year before. So we see rapid growth in terms of the utilization of these kind of social tools by more affluent travelers, more so than we do by less affluent travelers. Two other measures you see here. If they posted a photo during the past 12 months, you notice that that's declined slightly, not statistically significant, but directionally down, and written or commented on a travel-related blog, up slightly. So the headline here for us is that total engagement seems to be plateauing slightly, but what's happening is we see a significant lift in the utilization and the engagement of social media among more affluent travelers. Now this illustrates the trend line for the generational groups, and here's the statement again. They've gone into a community website or a blog past 12 months, and not surprisingly, you'll notice on the left the highest incidence of travelers who do that is among millennials. No surprise there. You'll notice the comparable percentages for the other three age cohorts roughly the same, but this is what's counterintuitive. Okay, and this goes back to the income penetration, where you can see that households with incomes between 50 and 125,000, that reported incidence is 33%, but you'll notice among households with an income of 250 plus, that's the top roughly 2.5%, 3% of households in the country today. You'll notice that that incidence is pushing 50%. So the headline here is that social is beginning to evolve as a tool that appears to have greater penetration and engagement with more affluent travelers. So if that's a market of interest to you on the phone, then you would want to pay attention to that. The other interesting phenomenon here is not only are the utilization rates up, but also this sense of trust and reviews among affluent travelers is up. I mean, look at these numbers. Here's the statement: I trust online reviews more than the opinions of my friends and family. Interesting observation. 20% of affluents said they agreed with that, and 31%, 15. You say, well, how is that possible? And again, we could speak for hours on the psychology that appears to be driving this, but there is a direct relationship between affluence, education, and the utilization of a lot of these online tools. As you might expect, as you go up the ladder of affluence, among more affluent households, you see higher rates of engagement and utilization. And because they have a natural kind of inquisitiveness about the world around them, and that includes, if they're going to go to Tuscany for a trip and visit some vineyards, they're going to spend a lot more time probably online, looking at reviews and evaluating options and so forth than someone who purchased a package tour to get on a bus and have similar experiences that may be less affluent, and one of the reasons why they purchased the package tour. So anyway, the point to be made is that this level of engagement is really quite remarkable. Okay, the last thing we want to share with you is something that the lodging business in America needs to pay very close attention to, and that is here you're looking at the incidence of utilization on at least one occasion of the forms of accommodation on the left. So the way you'd read this is that in 2013, 83% of all active travelers in America stayed in a hotel or motel on at least one occasion. If you look to the right of that, the 2015 data point, which is circled in gray, you'll notice that number has dropped to 74%. Now, you also know between 2013 and 15, we just demonstrated, is the actual volume of travel has increased significantly. So what's happening is, even though there are more people traveling, the incidence of their utilization of conventional lodging is declining. Now, if you take a look at what's happening through the balance of this chart, you see some really interesting kind of trend lines. And we would not in any way suggest that, a 2-year difference in these data points makes a trend, but directionally it's kind of interesting when we take a look at what the data suggests to us. And more interesting when we take a look at this by generational cohorts. So if you look at the top of this slide, you can see again we've got the data now pulled out by these 4 buckets. And where you see these orange circles are denoting a statistically significant result compared to the comparable data that you would read on the row. So for example, if you look at the resort 28% for millennials, that 28% is statistically significantly higher than the 22, the 18, and the 13. So the way we would interpret that is that the millennials clearly overexpress in terms of their utilization of resorts. Now, simply scanning this table, forget the numbers, just take a look at the number of red dots. And what the number of red dots is telling us is that millennials clearly have different lodging preferences than Xers, boomers, or matures. Now, you might think, well, intuitively you knew that, but this quantifies that. This also, I think, points to some of the interesting opportunities as well as the interesting challenges that are going to face the lodging industry as more and more consumers discover alternatives, whether it's the private residence alternative, whether it's the rented condominium or vacation home, the timeshare, and so on and so forth. There's so many options. And what we're seeing is, again, that the shift in pattern and preference among primarily millennials. For those of you that watch the lodging business, these numbers are striking. 21% of the leisure of all travelers, I should say, in America, stayed in a condo resort as an alternative to a traditional hotel the past 2 years. Look to the number on the right. 35% are interested. I mean, that's a formula for a new industry. And as you probably know, there are a lot of big public companies that are looking precisely at these data. And the same is true when it comes to vacation home rentals. 23% of all travelers have actually stayed in one of these in the past 2 years, but 4 out of 10 say they're interested. So when you see these kinds of differences between the actual behavior and the interest, you have to follow that trail. And when you follow that trail, it takes you to some very interesting places. And clearly the message here is condominium and private home rental options and businesses have a very, very bright future. And certainly when you connect that dot to the one that I just mentioned about millennials, I think, kind of amplifies that conclusion. Last thing I'll share with you, and then happy to try to take a few questions. And one of the things we do with the American Traveler is we also ask a lot of questions for which we get answers that never make it in the public domain. And a lot of this is for our own market intelligence. Sometimes it's for our clients' market intelligence. But we also want to understand some of the underlying shifts in kind of human behavior that drive a lot of these travel decisions. So one of the things that we have been tracking, it's kind of fun, is we ask the question, what are the things you do more of on vacation? And depending on how people answer that, we give you some interesting clues in terms of how you might want to communicate with them, engage with them, and so forth. And the answer to that is 51% of American travelers eat more on vacation, 40% drink more alcoholic beverages, 31% have sex more, 31% sleep more, and 18% exercise more. Now that's a lot to process quickly, but I would simply conclude by telling you that this is typically the sequence in which these things happen on a vacation. And on that cheery note, Joy and Jim, I'm going to turn it back to you, other than to say if there's anybody on the call that would like to learn more about the American Traveler or the Travel Horizon Survey, we invite you to come into the website. Both of these are subscription studies, and they are far deeper than what I've done here in 45 minutes in terms of content. We also make proprietary passes at the database available. So if someone says, gee, I'm interested to know who in the country is interested in visiting New Orleans or San Francisco, the answer is we can tell you. And we can profile that individual with up to 100 different variables, looking at everything from their media habits to social values and things of that nature. But anyway, I'll stop there and we'll open it up for any questions.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that presentation and taking the time to be with us today. Just a reminder that if you do have questions, to use the questions tab on your GoToWebinar panel. Briefly, we do have a couple people who asked if we would be sharing a copy of the presentation deck. Yes, that will be shared with you along with the recording of the webinar. So check your email. That should come to you in about 2 to 3 business days. Our first question comes from Ben in Mountain View, California, who has some more questions about millennial travelers and wants to know if you saw any other destination characteristics, maybe certain destinations that they found desirable or destination characteristics, maybe maybe they're more interested in culinary or outdoor travel or culture that you found significantly different?
Yeah, a great question. The answer is absolutely. There are certainly destination preferences for millennials that tend to be more urban in nature as opposed to matures and boomers that tend to be more established destinations, a lot of emerging destinations, and we could probably all recite what those are. The interesting thing, though, is when it comes to like adventure travel, in some of the things that I think people have ascribed to millennial interests don't show up in our work. Rather, those kinds of travel experiences, according to our data, and again, bear in mind that we screen the household income, so what I'm about to say may not be reflective of the total travel population. But those kinds of experiences tend to resonate more with Gen Xers, and to a lesser extent matures, but primarily a little older crowd, one generation above millennials in terms of the age cohort. But I'm giving you a kind of I'm skimming the top of the answer because I could go very deeply into that. But hopefully that would suffice. That's a wonderful example of the kind of thing I just talked about. So I don't know if the gentleman who asked the question has interest in learning more about that, but that's the kind of thing that we can actually tag in our database and then create this very robust profile of, for millennials, what are the destinations that rise to the top and the characteristics and booking patterns and so forth.
Perfect. The next question asks about if this covers both domestic and international travel intentions, and if you've seen any differences between those two given the value of the U.S. dollar abroad.
Yeah, and the answer is we do, and I didn't report that here, but I will tell you interest in traveling internationally has risen to an all-time high in our metrics, and the number today, and I may be off a point or two, is something on the order of about 45 to 46% of all leisure travelers in America tell us that they have interest in taking an international trip in the next 2 years. That's a very substantial number. Now that would include Canada and Mexico, naturally. The other thing I'll mention is traditionally it's destinations in Western Europe that have dominated the preference of prospective international travelers. That has changed somewhat to the point where in the general population the destination preference that has risen to the very top is the Caribbean, interestingly enough. And I think that's got something to do with proximity and value and so forth. But also we notice that those destination preferences clearly change by age. So if you take a look at the kinds of destinations that would be of interest to older travelers internationally, not surprisingly, those are going to look a lot different than, say, millennials and Xers, which tend to be more north-south than they are east-west. So if you take a look at interest in things like travel to Asia and so forth, that interest tends to be concentrated primarily among older travelers.
And have you noticed if there's any difference in the age groups? Are millennial travelers willing to travel further than the older generation?
No, actually it's the other way around, which is interesting, and the reason for that is that typically it's matures that have the luxury of time to do that. And one of the interesting constraints on millennial travel is time. And as a result of that, we've seen this continued reduction in the length of vacations in America. So you're far more likely to get 3 days here, 4 days there as a millennial and an Xer than you are 10, 12, 14 days elsewhere as a boomer or mature, which is a very interesting pattern because what it does is it in many ways restricts the destinations that can market to that group. A wonderful example would be Hawaii, and if you just think about the time it requires to travel from the mainland to get there, and it's not something that people typically do for a weekend. So what that means is, the market is constrained in many respects by available time, which is directly correlated to a generational cohort.
That's very interesting. The next question is about the hotel industry, and they ask if the amount of people utilizing hotels is down, why are lodging metrics at this time so high? does that mean that the shrinking group of traditional hotel travelers are traveling more frequently?
That's exactly it. Yeah, the actual number of trips that are being taken by those travelers is up. So even though the percentage utilizing that as an alternative for accommodations is down, what's happening is that's being offset by the actual number of not only trips by those who are traveling, but the length of stay, which has also gone up slightly over the course of the past really 4 or 5 years.
The next question is about native advertising, and they ask, how do you think content distribution such as native advertising will impact different phases of the traveler's journey?
Well, it's fascinating, and I'm not sure that I'm able to give anybody a really definitive advertising or comment on that. We've certainly looked at that in our agency. We participate in developing and placing that in our agency, but I think the presumption is that because it's native, it's going to be more credible and more informative. But I think that really, in many respects, kind of compromises the intelligence of the people who are exposed. And that is increasingly, we know that every time we look at something, whatever the source of information may be, there's probably some kind of commercial intent associated with that. So I think the jury's out with respect to the real impact on that. I mean, the irony today in messaging and marketing for me is, as it has become easier to reach people, it has become more difficult to influence people. And if you think about that for a second, I mean, that's a real conundrum, right? There are lots of ways to get in front of people. I mean, social is a wonderful example. The question is, how much influence does that have? And I think anybody that would try to tell you they've got that figured out, I would be very cautious about, because this is so dynamic. And it's changing, month to month in terms of not just how consumers are being exposed and consuming that, but also the content that's being developed and pushed into these various distribution methods.
Yeah, that's a really great point. We have a question that they want to know if there's any new trends on how leisure travelers are choosing destinations based on special interests, such as culinary, special events, cycling, culture.
Sure. Yeah, there's no question that we see a lot more vertical interests in travel. By that I mean, small groups of people who have an expressed interest in a certain type of recreational activity, and those numbers have been growing. One of the reasons, by the way, why and I passed over this quickly, but I think it's worth a mention, that we see that vertical magazines, special interest magazines, play a very important role in the inspiration stage that I talked about. Certainly the online extensions of those do as well. But the idea is that you see clusters of people who have these really well-formed interests, and we're beginning to measure things like adventure outfitter trips, culinary trips, wine tasting trips, heritage trips. But all of these are still in the single digits. Okay, when you take a look at the distribution of all the vacations taken by Americans, they're still in the very low single digits compared to the conventional things like going to a theme park or taking a cruise or a beach vacation, that kind of thing. But they're growing.
All right, I think we've got time for about one more question, and they want some more information on what's the cost and what is exactly needed to do a destination profile.
If I'm understanding the question, so if someone were interested in tagging the database, first order of business is, do we have sufficient sample to run the analysis? And so it's tough for me to answer that question until I answer the question about cost, until I can answer that first question. So I would say someone that would have that interest, they could simply send me an email. We'd be happy to look at whether or not we have in the 2800 a sufficiently robust sample to do that. I'll give you an example. Today I just made a presentation to the Texas Travel Industry Association annual meeting, and one of the things that I disclosed to them is the percentage of leisure travelers who in the U.S. have expressed interest in coming to Texas on a vacation the next 2 years. That number, just for everybody's benefit, is 17%. And now that represents a very robust, part of the sample of the 2,800. There are certain, minimum metrics that we need to achieve, so we make sure that we can manage what's called the error variance in that. But so the first question is, do we have enough observations? And then from there, the question is how deeply that destination will want to go. So anybody that has that interest, I'm more than happy to respond offline once they've answered a few questions from me.
All right, thank you so much. And if anyone on the line does have more questions for Peter about research and taking a deeper dive, you see his email address up on the screen. I just want to thank Peter and the whole MMGUI team once again for putting this webinar together with DMAI. If we didn't get to your questions, don't worry, we'll be passing them along to Peter so he can follow up afterwards. Thank you again, and we'll look forward to seeing you on future DMAI webinars.
Thank you very much.